Iheka is the author or editor of 4 books. His African Ecomedia, Network Platforms and Planetary Politics, on which today's talk is based, received 6 book prizes and honors, including the 2022 African Studies Association Best Book Prize, the Eco-Criticism Book Award of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, and the Harold and Margaret Sprout Award of the International Studies Association. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Dr. Iheka.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marcel. Thanks, Chris, for the tech. Um, I'm going to keep the tech very minimal because I don't trust tech, as you can see, from our encounter already. I also won't be talking about AI, so let me put that out there before we start. I thank Marcel again for inviting me. Um, my friend and co-conspirator for many years, Paul. It's good to be here. Thanks, Professor Ugo, for the recommendation. Can you hear me? Okay, all right. Yeah, so I will just jump right into it. I'm really looking forward to our discussion with Paul and Adoa later. So let's start. Technology changes humans' environment, making ours a prosthetic humanity. Airplane, cars, cell phones, the internet. These have transformed lives and reshaped human capabilities, delivering goods and services at unprecedented speed. Yet, as Dr. Benjamin reminds us, every document of civilization is a document of barbarism. Consider the invention of the airplane by the Wright brothers in 1904, and how, a decade later, this magnificent invention became a weapon of war. You can name other examples too, but the underlying point is that technological progress always comes at a cost. Africa has always borne this cost, whether it is the testing of pharmaceuticals in Nigeria, or atomic testing in the Sahara, or the successive regimes of extraction and disposal across the continent. Technology, they say, heralds newness, change, but from an African perspective, we have never been innovative. The story is consistent. It has been one of exploitation, of paying the debt of civilization. It is this sameness in the face of change that interests me. My talk today highlights Africa's positionality as the risk laboratory of the world's technological advancement, a lab that must stay hidden to celebrate the achievements of modernity. Working against the strategic invisibility of the laboratory, I turned to ecological media produced about Africa to highlight the exacting cost of innovative progress across the continent and the rerouting of low-tech infrastructure to reconstitute the fragmented social. In my work on ecological media, that is cultural production, from film to photography, to sculpture and artistic expression, to resources such as oil and coltan, the question of seeing and sight and reversing erasures are crucial. Take, for instance, the film Thank You for the Rain, where Kisilu laments at the beginning, "Why can't we be seen?" This is in reference to the camera's inability to clearly illuminate black skin in the dark in its poor Kenyan community without electricity. This question takes on special significance as Kisilu joins other climate activists at the Paris Climate Summit COP21, where they make a case for reduced emissions and assistance for poor communities who have contributed little to global warming. Kisulu's question, "Why can't we be seen?" takes on salience as the summit ends without an agreement that would significantly reduce emission. The camera cannot quite capture black skin. African complaints go unheeded at the climate summit. The film's statements on ocularity and the technology of photographic capture resonates with the viral image of the young activist taken at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2020. Vanessa Nakate, then a 23-year-old climate activist from Uganda, had participated in a press conference with 4 other young activists, including the world-famous Greta Thunberg. When the Associated Press released a picture of the activists later, only 4 of them appeared, all of them white. The black African Nakati had been cropped out. The AP characterized the omission as a mistake that occurred as the photo was being edited to create a close-up of Ms. Thunberg and to remove a building behind Nakati. If the photograph presents the interplay of light and dark, of black and white, the extinguishing of blackness here accentuates light. That is white. Did they even think seriously about this response? I mean, the black activist was removed to make further space for an already hypervisible white one. Nakati herself would cite the racism of the climate justice movement in her response to the unfortunate incident, which ironically popularized her name and work. African peoples and the environment constitute ground zero for, for technological complicity in the interplay of visibility and erasure, of aliveness and decimation. The camera is functioning here as a technology of obliteration. More specifically, even as it elucidates the subjectivities of others, it has been detrimental to the fullest realization of Africans. This ambivalence of realization and obliteration is the defining feature of the haunted and haunting film, Lemuhang Jeremiah Moses' film, This Is Not a Burial, It Is a Resurrection, a film on one elderly woman's mobilization against a dam project in landlocked Lesotho in southern Africa. In historic Lesotho, dams have been built through the Islands Water Project to generate hydropower and revenue from supplying water to South Africa. Building these dams, including the Katse and Maole Dam, have displaced communities. The film's opening sequence foreshadows the flooding of the village, with a town crier or oral historian ululating in between recounting the devastation brought by the flooding. Between the mournful ululation using the lesiba, he repeats the sobering point that the church bell tolls underneath the dam. The rest of the film then takes us back to the struggle to resist the project and offers a snapshot of village life before the dam's construction. Dams have enamored with post-colonial states in Africa and beyond as markers of state power and because of their spectacular character. But this narrative of progress and power must stand in relation to the dispossession and displacements of communities whose landscape is submerged by dam construction. The Indian writer and activist Arundhati Roy captures this devastation in the case of India's Sardar Sarovar Dam in The Greater Common Good. In this polemical text against globalization and unsustainable development, she declaims, quote, big dams as India's greatest planned environmental disaster. Roy's activist work and her writing critique the developmental agenda of the state and its exclusionary practices, railing against the state's sinister collaboration with corporate power and the suffering imposed on the ordinary people. Closer to home, the historian Stephen Misha has recently published A Dam for Africa, where he details Kwame Nkrumah's obsession with the construction of the Akosombo Dam, the promise of electrification and relocation of displaced people, and how the non-realization of the dam's possibilities indexes the failures of the Ghanaian state. From Roy to Misha, we encounter the logic of development, driving the planned dam in This Is Not a Burial. Andrew Finberg has written of those left out of the design process and how they ultimately, quote, suffer the undesirable consequences of technologies, close quote. This insight from critical technological studies applies to the film. There is no room for the villagers or their input as they are informed of the developmental project and instructed to leave by the politicians. In short, dam projects in the development world in Lesotho and elsewhere are routinely top-down developmental projects. In the film, the member of parliament who announces the people's displacement from their land gleefully screams, up with development, as it recounts the supposed benefits of the dam. But the film protagonist, the widow Mantua, knows that development is synonymous with destruction. In fact, I want to argue that the film foreshadows its argument about the dam as an infrastructure of dispossession by linking prior technologies to destruction. The mine and radio stand out in the film as antecedent prior technologies of destruction. We learn earlier in the film about the celebration honoring the widow's son who returns from working in the mine. Celebration here does not just mark arrival, it is a sacrificial offering, a thanksgiving in gratitude for averting accidents. For averting accidents, the cave-in that would eventually claim the miner's life. The miner, the film suggests, lives on borrowed time, and every living day is worth celebrating for postponing the inevitable date with death. This miner forms part of the discard, the residue that Gabriel Echt allows us to in a study of the aftermath of mining around Johannesburg, where migrants and Black South Africans contributed to building the city of gold while endangering their health and excluded from belonging in the city. Lesotho and neighboring countries fed the South African mines with bodies since the discovery of gold that transformed Johannesburg in the late 19th century. Since 1886, men have come from all over Southern Africa and beyond to work in the mines. But lowering men into the earth to mine gold endangered them and the environment. The adverse effects of mining are not restricted to these workers. The operation produced toxic waste that imperils humans and the ecological system more broadly. Studies conducted around tailing dams have shown dangerous levels of heavy metals and other pollutants. The danger of acid mine drainage persists even when old mines close or abandoned, threatening the lives of South Africans, often poor and black, who live in proximity to mine dams due to housing shortage. So, put this differently, workers and those who live nearby carry contamination that may take years and decades to manifest. That is the slow violence that Rob Nixon has eloquently theorized. Oil, gold, diamond, coltan, and even rubber mined in Africa have produced the world's wealth and powered cars, cell phones, and other technologies of capitalist modernity. The artifacts I collect here insist that the story of innovation and progress is at worst a lie, at best partial, incomplete. Bringing the story to completion, the media projects I assemble point to the lives and communities, that is, those disposable people that make progress possible. So return to the film then is to see that the film's evocation of mining that would eventually claim the woman's son is this establishment of a precedent. In law, precedents are taken seriously and offer a sense of direction. It portends how the past has been made, and it shows how the present and future cases will go. In the film's opening evocation of the mines and its haunting sound and soundtrack, the film recalls the multitude from Southern Africa lost to the gold mines and their reverberations in the presence of another ecological disaster, which is the dam. We need no prophecy, just the precedents to understand the community's future in the wake of the dam. The film foretells this future not only with the mine, but also in the present radio that Mantao listens to. It is telling that the initial sounds from the radio when she picks it up is static. This is noise devoid of signal. The initial sound suggests miscommunication or gap between signal and noise. We also see her removing the batteries, perhaps to extend their life, rendering the radio lifeless. Brought to our purposes, the disorienting static and unpowered radio speak volumes. They do not bode well. When Mentao later catches a signal, it is of death. The signal repeatedly reels off obituaries of those who have died. The radio performs wake work to borrow from Christina Sharp, and the widow persists in the wake, of her husband's death, her sons, and those announced on the radio. Death persists as the radio structure of feeling in the film, even if the emancipatory power of radio technology in Africa has been well documented. Our colleague at Indiana, Marissa Morman, for instance, tracks the overturning of the settlers' colonial agenda when they introduced the radio in the 1930s, as the radio was used for clandestine anti colonial activities and mobilization of a national identity in Angola. Morman and others may advance the oppositional work of radio, but this is not a barrier links radio technology to static, noise, and to death. Mantau is a figure of precedent and future orientation in the film. Scratch that, she prophesies a futureless world in the face of precedents, from radio, from mining. And it is within this ecology of death and devastation that Mantau situates a dam project, which will flood the village. Whereas the politician talks of resettlement, she insists on inhabitation. Can the dead speak? What does the dead make of progress? In a powerful scene, Mantau asks about the fate of the cemetery, and when this is dismissed, she declares that the cemetery is the village. Mantau presses the claim to the village beyond the living. The dead too belong, tied as they are, as ancestors to the living, and as linked to the past and the future. When Mantau backs away from the politician, extolling the dam in This Is Not a Burial, she is enacting a form of environmentalism of the poor. Our backing away and walking off is a defiant refusal to be part of the devastation of the land by flooding, a refusal to displace the living from their ancestors. Mantau reproduces an accounting sheet that values the non-economic and the statistically insignificant. Coefficients that are written out of the calculus of technological value. But our imagery of the vast village as cemetery also speaks to the future of the flooded village, evoked in the film's early scene. A cemetery of collective remains, human and non-humans alike. In its intimacy with death, the film registers its membership in a category that Marcel O'Gorman has described as necromedia, defined by the quote, interrelatedness of death and technology, close quote. The incontrovertible link between death and technology that O'Gorman describes is kind of the presiding theme and tempo of Moses' film. In such an atmosphere of death, however, Mantau does not deny finitude or seek immortality as the subject of technoculture that O'Gorman analyzes. Mantau expects and anticipates death. In fact, she prays for it, embracing being toward death in principle. This deadly disposition provides the clarity and the courage for her to bark at the politicians' technocratic messianism and to confront the militarism of their eviction. Taken together, this film is important not only because of its figuration of displacement from the dam, but for situating the present dispossession within a larger context of ecological removal and disturbance. Like the dam, the progress brought about by mining and the radio has devastated people and the land. Moses' film deserves our attention for its investment in the compounding losses caused by technology and its refusal to cede the ground to an economic calculus that devalues place and people. The film may tackle difficult subjects, but its exercisation of the ecology is comforting. The hills, sheep, and the river are colorfully and carefully situated as part of this village's living beings. Representations here heightens the stake of existence and disappearance in this ecology. As such, even as the community is forced away from the village toward the city, from the plains of weeping, as the film describes Nazareta village where it is set, Mantau withdraws from the group and makes her way back. In the closing moments of the film, Mantau reverses the trajectory of those making a demand on the city, as we see in the work of David Harvey and others. Pressing her right to the village, Mantau strips, raises her hand, and approaches their victors, who demand that she stops. Stop! Don't come any closer. But the defiant Mantau refuses the command. Remarkably, the camera shifts from out to a young girl, the sign of futurity, of resurrection, who intently watches her defiance, in a move that suggests a symbolic transfer of power. The somber tone and sorrowful mood of the film does not dissipate as it ends, and that's why I want to stay with the image of Mantau instead of the young girl. It almost seems certain that technology will get the resistant Mantau, but which one? The dam or the bullets from the militarized state intent on development? Can Mantau succeed in dancing the gun to silence, as Ken Saro-Wiwa commands in a poem on the Niger Delta oil crisis in Nigeria? Will she be suffocated by the flood, as oil has done to inhabitants of the Delta, as we see in the work of Paul Ugo and other scholars of the Niger Delta? These examples testify to the contradictions of technology. They are tools of destruction, but they are also the assemblages of emotions, affects, intensities, and existences that are left out of the stories of technological triumphs. To adapt Benjamin to our purposes, they are the civilizational documents of enlightenment, enlightening us on the barbarism of progress. Let me close with a further discussion of the contradictions of technology in Africa, this time with Sarita Segul and Greg Mitman's documentary on land rights in Liberia, entitled The Land Beneath Our Feet. Segul and Mitman's documentary foregrounds the perspectives of the Liberians as they tell their own stories, unlike in the archival footage shown in the film, where Africans are seen but not heard. This footage, which this is a kind of meta documentary, the footage is from the Harvard expedition to Liberia in 1926, an expedition supported by the Firestone Corporation, a company that makes tires propelling our cars. One of the film directors, Greg Mitman, encountered the footage when he was invited to serve as consultant on another film project. Mitman is also the link to the film protagonist, Emmanuel Ure, who at the time was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where Mitman teaches. He's a professor of environmental history there. The land follows Emmanuel, who returns to Liberia with his degree and with the footage from the 1926 expedition. This archival footage shows the clearing of land and Africans working to build roads and rowing boats across water. Newspaper headlines also mark the Harvard Biomedical Expedition to Liberia, supported by Firestone between July 7 and November 21, 1926. One prophetic newspaper headline in the film reads, quote, Firestone declares door is open in Liberia. It is significant that the company, not the people of Liberia, is the agent here, thereby registering upfront the dispossession of the people. The people's agency is denied in this forceful door opening, but as they are conscripted to build roads, and as they are displaced from their communities to grant concession to Firestone. Part of the film's visual style is its use of parallel editing to demonstrate a continuation of dispossession in contemporary concessions. As the film cuts from archival footage to the present and back, it establishes a long history of extractive practices. The documentary suggests that the improvement of the video quality notwithstanding, there is no substantial improvement in the lives and the conditions of the Liberian people. Put differently, the people and the land remain rightless subjects, making the audiovisual advancements more a matter of surface than of substance. The film's significance, however, comes from its recalibration of the footage. When Emmanuel shows the footage as he travels around Liberia, the resonance is strong. People have limited knowledge of this history, so the footage becomes a pedagogical tool. As Emmanuel travels around, showing the footage on phone and computer screens, young people begin to expand the historical knowledge of their country. The footage actualizes a participatory culture of engagement among citizens and presents an opportunity for the young to query the older generation about their experience. Emmanuel takes cinema and technology on the road in a move that echoes Alexander Jedlowski's notion of small screen cinema. Small screen culture promotes wide distribution of pirated copies through flash drives, phones, and computer transfers. but they also enable official viewing using television, internet streaming, and mobile downloads. A manual circulation of the 1926 footage shares some of the features of small screen culture. The mobile and communal mode of exhibition orchestrates a social community and contributes to forging a national culture. In the screening of the footage, film is not a solitary act of individual consumption or a passive personal experience in a theater. Viewing is happening here in groups with the congregants commenting on the footage at the same time. The space for film viewing and commentary is striking, creating a dialogic process of interaction between film and audience, among the audience, and between audience and the land. In this theory and practice of film production, distribution, and consumption, the land concretizes its standing as a technology of social aggregation. Let me end here. Ultimately, the land beneath our feet models a participatory culture that could inform innovation going forward. The 1926 expedition seen in the film was designed for biomedical research into tropical diseases and to collect specimens for knowledge production. Enjoying Firestone's support, the expedition yielded the capture of Africans and their ecologies on camera, as well as the physical looting of ecological resources, including plants and animals. The expedition indexes the role that Africa has played as an exclusionary, non-participatory innovation lab for the world before and after. Out of sight, it is the site of experimentation and violent extractions. Viewed from Africa, we've never really been modern or innovative. To produce meaningful innovation will require disruption of the status quo to bring back the ethical concerns for an input of the missing order. To counteract this problem of technology, we must account not only for the here and the now, an accountability to those at the farthest end of the earth and to the future, to those yet to come, is the starting point for measuring our sense of and cost of innovation and progress. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Cajetan, very much. A lot to think about there. I'd like to invite our conversants up to the front now so that we can have a chat, and I'll introduce them. It's happening. We had a fantastic talk, so thank you so much for that. And that's what matters. So these events always feature a conversation, and I'm here to facilitate that. I'm not here to ask probing, talking head questions, but I want to introduce our conversants. So I'll start down at the end. Dr. Paul Ugar is my colleague in the Department of English. He's a professor, and his research and teaching interests are in the areas of modern African literatures and cultures, Anglophone post-colonial world literatures, cultural studies, global Black studies, and new media cultures in the global South. He's the author of Nollywood, Popular Culture and Narratives of Youth Struggles in Nigeria, and co-editor of several collections, including Youth and Popular Culture in Africa and African Youth Cultures in the Age of Globalization. Did I get that right, Paul? Yes. Okay. Second conversant today is Adjoa Appiah. Adjoa is a PhD candidate in sustainability management at the University of Waterloo School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development, also known as SEED. She previously worked with leading financial institutions in Africa, including the African Development Bank and Ecobank, where she gained experience in environmental management and sustainability, as well as corporate and transaction banking. Her research interests are in sustainability management with emphasis on sustainable banking, sustainable finance, and climate governance. Current research focuses on commercial banks and Africa's contribution to sustainability and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And Adjoa asked me when we had our first meeting, what am I doing here? Adjoa is one of Adjoa's colleagues in environment, another PhD student. I was asking around looking for someone to be a respondent, and they said, well, Adjoa would be perfect for this. So we're going to see. We don't want to hold you up to that, but we'll have some questions. I'm just going to invite Paul and Adjoa to begin with some comments or remarks they may want to start with Cajetan.
Professor Iheka, thank you so much for that rich and insightful presentation. And once again, I welcome you to Waterloo and the University of Waterloo. People were really wondering whether or not you're going to make it here, being a big shot with all of that busy schedule, whether or not you would make it here. So thank you so much for squeezing time from your busy schedule to visit the University of Waterloo. So thank you so much. So in your presentation, you offer us essentially an arsenal of imageries, all of them pointing to, testifying to, and documenting this long history of ecological degradation in the continent. Now, you remember in 2018 when your first book, Naturalizing Africa, came out. I was in a panel reviewing the book. And at the end of that panel, you and I had a bit of a back and forth around the place of violence. Over and over again, we've pointed to this long history of violent extractivisms in the continent, right? The question I keep asking, and the point you made in Naturalizing Africa at the time was that you were opposed to violence by non-state actors, responding to the violence being caused by multinational oil corporations across the Gulf of Guinea, not particularly in Nigeria. So at the time, we were talking about oil bunkering by youth in the Niger Delta region, spearheaded by men, right? And here we are, 6 years down the road. You are still showing us imageries of that violence. In other words, corporate violence hasn't ended. So I'm wondering, and you and I just came from a class where we screened Fernand's work. I am wondering, are you reconsidering the value of derivative violence? Because that kind of endorser violence sort of is ceaseless, is endless. And at what point can we just begin to purely depend on aesthetic formations in creating awareness about this violence?
So do we take the questions? Or should I respond or should we? I should. Okay, okay. Okay, yeah, yeah, thank you for, yeah, thanks for the question. It's good to be here. Yeah, I think what I would say is really this, that, let's go with the logic of of the argument that yes, that there is the counter violence is has a place, and I respect the sentiment and impetus behind it. But in the place of the Niger Delta, for instance, the fact that you've had this years and decades of counter violence by non-state actors have not necessarily remove the problems that we're talking about. It is still the case that those communities continue to be impoverished. Their land remains polluted. A few non-state actors may have benefited from taking up violence, but I think I am still not convinced that it's brought about. It's brought about a significant improvement in the conditions of the ecology or in the lives of the people who are embedded in that ecology. So in the light of that, I think, I'm really still, staying with that argument I was making there. Because what you find out then is that with the logic of violence we are suggesting here, that who ultimately suffers? Who ultimately suffers are the people themselves and the environment. It is not the government. It is not the oil company per se. Yeah, the oil company's worker is kidnapped. They pay money, they are released. The Nigerian state comes in, swoops in with the violence. So what are they going to get? Not men's leadership. It is the people in the communities who are exposed, who are exposed. So they are in between the militants and the government, suffering. So I think, that's I think part of why we continue to need these imaginative portals is the fact that we really need to rethink our strategies for thinking about these problems. And I think these portals, these imaginative portals in literature and film and different kind of stories, they don't they don't offer all the answers. But I think there's this imaginative opening that they give us that allows us to continue to imagine and think of what this future can be. And that is what is important about them. That is why we should stick with them, as we continue to rethink what it will be. The violence it has not stopped. It has not stopped. This violence. Fanon prophesied there in in Richard of the Earth, which he published in 1961. And you think about that, it's from Algeria to where what has violence done ultimately in those places now. The project of decolonization has been arrested in all of these places where we held violence as the means to dislodge France or other European countries, or whether it's been used to dislodge the local leaders. So I want to stop there, but to say that I understand and I respect what is driving violence as a way of tackling this disaster. But when the community members go and spill oil along the way and cause the kind of fire that the Jesse incident that about, that you researched, and all that. And when the military comes and swoops on them and subject them to violence for these things, I just don't see benefits ultimately, even though I understand what's behind that logic.
Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. And yes, thank you, Marcel, for extending this invitation to me. As I was listening to your talk and also reflecting on African Ecomedia, I was just wondering that on the flip side, I think even looking at what my research is looking into, I decided to focus on African banks because the narrative about financing sustainability is often around government to government or donor helping. But my thesis is based on the argument that commercial banks are key economic players and they can contribute towards sustainability. And indeed, my hypothesis is that they're doing something and that needs to be showcased. And so now as I was reflecting on the Ecomedia, I was looking at it through the positive lens that even the good things that they are doing, you can use the power of media to showcase that. But then that leads me to the question that what do you think can be the role of Ecomedia in bringing out greenwashing activities by these corporates? So it wouldn't just be commercial banks, but I'll think of tech companies that may be saying that we're doing ABC, but on the ground, they are negatively impacting the people whose resources are being extracted. So that would just be my first question to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, thanks for being here. It's good to be in conversation with colleagues in sustainability. Our humanities bubble. I think I think part of what's when I came into I remember as I was writing Ecomedia, the book that became African Ecomedia, and when I speak from me, one of the challenges was always the fact that why are you showing these images? Why are you showing these images of these black bodies, who are the exploitation and things like that? And I wrestled with that for quite a bit. And it struck me, and I'm like, maybe I should just leave out these images and not talk about them, or maybe not even include them in the book. But it struck me that, well, but just like the question of violence, it doesn't, but that occlusion, not showing these images, continues that occlusion. Rather, the question becomes, what am I doing with those images? And I think, to answer your question, that, the strategic use of images like like these ones, they can become, powerful ways of bringing about conversation about greenwashing. It's always that, media hides, in my last 2 weeks in my post-colonial ecologist class, I was teaching a novel called Happiness by a Sierra Leonean author. And in the novel, there's this conversation about animals and the threats that they pose into a community. And there's a council meeting. And this guy who is against the animals goes and brings a video, basically does this matchup of videos, animals taking people's kids, animals taking people's animals and people's pets. And what that mashup does is really to provoke a kind of fear and anxiety in the people. That is a negative use of this image. It's a negative use of media. But media can be put to productive use. And the same media that can be used for fear and anxiety can actually be used to inspire hope, to show some form of collaboration that are positive. between, banks and communities. I listened, last semester I heard a talk in our School of Environment, about, it's in Kenya, financing projects. This is a ground up, micro credit scheme, financing green projects. But at the same time, we agree that some of these big technology, some of these companies, what they're doing is greenwashing. So I think, that one of the ways in which it's really the kind of projects here, showing the underside of those projects, bringing in, because what happens there is that we don't get this, what we hear about is the company, what we are doing. But how do we, so what these images make possible is a kind of heterogeneity of voices, the voices of those impacted. I think when we focus on that, when we make them knowledge producers, we get to see the impact of that these projects are making on them. When we let them speak, as Spivak, writes about in the 80s, that is one way that we begin to counteract that problem of greenwashing.
I wonder if Paul wants to weigh in on this, and I have a question. I was going to ask a similar question, well, a kind of similar question, which is that Cajetan, in your book African Ecomedia, you actually mention poverty porn and the problem of showing these Black bodies as a spectacle. And I've given multiple presentations where I show images of people in Kenya and Sudan who are having their biometric data recorded by WorldCoin, and giving it up for WorldCoin tokens, and images of conflict mineral miners and guerrillas in the Congo. And I feel sometimes wrong for showing these images. And so I'm not asking for forgiveness for showing these images. I don't know. I don't know if it's no sign of the cross. I don't know if it's right, but I know that both of you work with this kind of imagery. And I do want to ask Aju a question about ESGs in a minute, but I want to address this image question first.
Yes, it is a thorny question, yeah, because it comes to, but I think what I've, and I talk about a kind of what I call a kind of strategic exposure in my book. And by this I mean, how, to what end are we exposing? How are we doing it? And in what way, and this is where, multimodality becomes important. It is not just the image, what else, what is going with the image. In post class today, there was this fine conversation about this documentary, this film about Fanon, and the way that, text and, different aesthetic processes are being used to highlight, this, fragmentation, the fragmentary life that Fanon was writing about Black people. And I think it's important then to think about, what story am I telling with this image, and in what way am I able to bring this story to life without, succumbing to mere objectification of the people? How do I make sure that subjectivity is the outcome of this exposure rather than objectification? What kind of stories can I tell about the subject, of this encounter? Can I, in what way can they speak? Can they express themselves in my presentation? So these are some of the ways in which, I try to counteract that problem, because I strongly believe that the alternative is to say, well, I don't want to show any of this. Let's forget about it. Where there's the same way in which, it furthers the project of, the venture capitalists and other, those kind of, big tech apparatuses that want to continue to tell a certain kind of story, a story that tells of triumph without bringing in those people. So it's important that we don't succumb to that in our bid. So our concern not to objectify them is important, but how we do it, in what way, how do we take what could be a potential objectification as an occasion for, for subjectivity? I think that is a question that we need to answer as we try to deal with. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it has become very common these days for neoliberal technocrats to point to Africa as sort of the new market, the imagined market, right? And what happens with that is that they whitewash this concrete reality of relentless violence going on in the continent. And the implication of that is that it gives people an opportunity to say, there's no evidence that this is happening. But it's not just in relation to Africa. We've seen this happening even here in Canada until people started digging up bodies from graves in
mhm,
residential schools, the idea was we didn't know this was happening,
All
right?
right.
And in the case of apartheid South Africa for a long time, the shame that came with this massive evidence of violence perpetrated by the apartheid machinery. And their argument at the time was, we had no idea this is happening, right? So in the era of fake news, where it's very easy for the media to dismiss any kind of allegation simply by saying it's fake news, there's no evidence. These kinds of images, however violent they are, would become the one thing we have to support the arguments that we're making about this kind of ongoing violence that has never stopped for centuries. But it brings me to the point that I was going to pose to Cajetan. In conversations in post-colonial eco-criticism in general, but also in relation to African nature writing, it has become very common to invoke Rob Nixon and the idea of slow violence. Yeah, this violence that is attritional, this violence that is invisible. But the question is, invisible for whom, right? All of this images you've shown us in Lesotho, in Kenya, and in Ghana, the people who live in these communities, whether they are constructing a dam, whether they're drilling oil, that violence is not invisible. It's a palpable thing they experience every day. At least in terms of people who have suffered chemical injuries resulting from, mining activities. So I'm wondering, from the work you're now doing, particularly in relation to sort of a new genre, media rather than traditional literature, do you think there is the need for us to find a new conceptual tool, sort of a new lens to help us sort of deal with this long history of violent extractivisms in the continent, sort of beyond slow violence? Because for the people who live in these places, that violence might be slow, but it's not invisible.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think what to begin from where you stop, that in terms of our toolkit, and that's something, that's a kind of intellectual promiscuity that I like to practice, and which is this relentless search for for different modalities. And that's what you see in my work. I'm not satisfied with being beholden with a certain tradition, a certain theory, a certain method. What I do really, I'm reading different fields and things like that. So that is why interdisciplinarity really mattered to me. So, but in terms of slow violence, I think so it's one of several other tools and concepts that are useful for us to think about. And there are moments. I agree with you that, for instance, in that several contexts in these communities, that this violence is clear, it's obvious to the people in these communities. But there are cases when they weren't. And I'll give you an example. When the mining industry, as people were working there, people were living nearby, there was a celebration of these activities, whether in South Africa, whether in Niger, where uranium is being mined. It was called a boom. The economy was doing well and things like that. But apart from those who had physical injuries from cave-ins and things like that, they didn't realize, that's the impact of silica in their bodies. That was not an obvious violence. And for many of these people, it took decades. And in fact, because it took so much time, the government have used an extended temporality to say, well, this is not an occupational injury. We don't owe you compensation. So I think it's in those moments of delayed appearances, where someone works in an uranium mine and over time develops cancer. And there's a good film called Alit, Arlit, which I write about in Ecomedia. And that film powerfully talks about that community. The community is called Alit, which is what the name film is named for. How for them, they were thinking of this moment in the 60s as this powerful moment. Until decades later, all those people that work in the mine have fallen in one way or the other to cancer. So slow violence remains relevant for that, and their struggle to make these French companies, however, to see that yes, this is connected to what happened in the workplace. So I think so slow violence continues to be relevant for occasions like that. But of course, there are direct exposures that clearly those that's visible right away. So slow violence, I think, is just one term, that is, that is useful for thinking about, these forms of violence, and we can replicate them in different form in different communities. That yes, they're not spectacular in the same way that a mining accident killed 55 people or 1,000 people. So yeah, so it remains relevant as a conceptual category for thinking about. But I think what's useful, and I think that is the power of the environmental humanities and post-colonial eco-criticism. The fact that it has been very much careful to draw, to draw from different, to draw from different fields, different traditions in finding language and tools, for making sense of the world.
Do you want to respond to this, or I'm wondering what you're thinking, because I'm wondering. I think your project is very different, maybe in tone and approach, and I'm not want to put you on the spot, but I'm putting you on the spot.
No, I just wanted to add on to what CJ talked about. So in Ghana, over the last few weeks, I'm guessing that because you're so much into Ecomedia, you may be following our news on Galamsey, which is small-scale illegal mining that has just sparked a lot of concern amongst the citizenry, and it's mainly because of Ecomedia. So for me, until I got involved in this, I didn't really know that that was what it was about. But through the use of WhatsApp, YouTube, everywhere you're seeing videos, people have used drones to actually capture what's happening. And all of a sudden, people are realizing that something needs to be done. And there's a lot of advocacy going on, people writing to the presidency, etc. Because the effects are clear. And we are saying that it doesn't need to take 10 years for us to see. All of a sudden, we don't have good drinking water again. And it doesn't matter whether you are rich or poor, we all taking our water from one source, right? And we're seeing the clear impact, apart from the fact that those engaging in it are going to be involved in occupational injury. There was a sad case of a pregnant woman who went to use the washroom and basically got swallowed down because the structure that the building was on is completely, the foundation is completely gone, and she died, right? And it made news. The BBC reported it, everybody reported it. That shows the value of the Ecomedia. So I was just reflecting on it and thinking that it's such a powerful tool. But my question now be, how do we get to use this tool to amplify the voices of these people? Because if it's not just one person or a few people, an NGO being so focused on it or being so concerned and making noise about it, people may not be bothered, right? So how do we really amplify? How can Ecomedia be used to amplify the voices of many of such things? This is just one example in Ghana with illegal mining. You may have the same with the dumping of e-waste. Back again in Ghana, we have Agbogboleshi and people taking the scrap metal and trying to sell it off. There's various examples. How can we amplify the voices of all these people who are impacted through the use of Ecomedia?
Yeah. Thank you. I think what's powerful for all the critiques we're making about technology and things like that, what's powerful about it is the kind of democratic, and I use democratic, advisedly and in full. The fact that that the tool, the media tool is not just in the hands of a few producers anymore. Yeah, we still have if we have a few media conglomerates who control, but the fact that using I follow some of that on social media. Galam says illegal mining, small scale mining, and I've followed that I've seen it through social media. So people are using WhatsApp, they're using Twitter, and they're talking, they're amplifying this problem, which has been there. Scholars have written about, but it's not really captured the popular imagination. In fact, I was thinking about it because Akua Bamfo, who presented at a conference that we had to, that we organized at Yale a few years ago, where you have a paper coming, a chapter deals is connecting Galamsey mining, back to, slavery in an interesting fashion. Connecting it back to slavery in an interesting fashion. But scholars have been thinking about this, but it just wasn't in the popular imagination in the same way. But it's taken in popular media, some incidents, catalyzing with popular media for this to become a global. So I think that kind of citizen media, that citizen media production, I think is important for. It is not just the filmmakers or the professional photographers anymore. It's not just the artists are doing they're playing their role in telling these stories. Mahama, the major Ghanaian artist Mahama has some projects on that's showing this question of mining, small scale mining. But we don't need just the Mahamas anymore. It's the fact that people can use their cell phones, people can use WhatsApp messages to deliver. So I think, so it is this amplification and multiplication of these different media sources that we need. And that's what is most useful today. So really, I think is the multiplication. Because what we see in the film I started from, Thank You for the Rain, it's just that notion that, nobody is seeing us. Nobody cares about us. And I think, that is changing gradually as now actually young people take these things into their hands, and Professor Ugo has written so much of youth cultures across the continent. That is where the salvation of that continent is going to come from. It is young people who are they're the ones, using cell phones and WhatsApp to ask the kind of questions about Galamsey. They're the ones using that to capture, to come back to the kind of work you do, to capture a budget of the country and say, well, Nigeria, the government, you said you used this amount for this. How is this possible? So the national consciousness is being probed, by as a virtue of so I don't want to romanticize media. I'm to romanticize media and technology, but it's the possibility is democratic possibility in terms of telling these stories. I think cannot be really overemphasized. Yeah.
CJ, you anticipated my question. I was going to redirect it to Paul about youth culture, and because Paul, you've written so much about youth culture in Africa, and I wonder if you want to follow up on that a little bit.
Where do I begin? I mean, often when we talk about Africa, the reference always is this is a young continent with about 75% of the population who are young people. And it is these young people who have the training to use the new media resources that we have now, cell phones to produce films. I just came from a workshop led by Tunde Kelani, sponsored by ADBN, where they were training young men and women in the Niger Delta to use their cell phones to produce documentaries, right? So we have a lot of media resources now that young people can use to create a massive global consciousness about what's happening. And what that means is that they don't have to rely on the government. They don't have to rely on the cultural elites, that they've created a space for themselves where they can reach a global audience about what's happening without any kind of intervention from the formal cultural sector. And I think Cajetan is right. That's where the activism is happening. But also for young people are not only using that technology to call awareness to the violence that is happening, but also young people are using these tools for survival, right? If you take an industry like Nollywood, if you take an industry like Afrobeat music, when the state fails in providing resources and amenity to young people have found a way to use these resources to create stupendous wealth for themselves, right? So we need to think about not only the ways in which young people are using these resources to create awareness, but also to use these resources to assert economic independence, right? And that allows them to do the kind of activism that they do, with or without the support of the state. And this is the kind of thing I think we need need to look at. Now, Cajetan, I was going to ask you one more question before. I hope that at some point we're going to take some questions from the online audience or people here. I think we should stop talking at some point and let other people talk. So, and when you were talking about that documentary, Thank You for the Rain in Kisulu, and I was struck by that phrase, why can't we be seen, right? The sense that people feel that there's no visibility to their miseries and no one is paying attention to the experiences and struggles. But so my question, and particularly since we're talking about technology, the power and impact of technology, it's not in technology itself. It's how that technology is used and who is using that technology. So I wanted to ask this, so coming back to your presentation, my question is the problem with technology or the problem is with its use?
Yeah, well, I think every tool can do good. You know, I started with the airplane for a good reason. The fact that, you know, you know, it was invented, of course, for transportation and things like that. But 10 years later, it became a tool of war. So it's really what we've, you know, what's the use of technology. But I'm glad that you posed this question in relation to Kisulu, because what I didn't say, because I wanted to get, because I'd written about it in the film, in the book, and I didn't want to dwell much of that. I wanted to focus more, say more about the things that had not been published, that if people had not gotten a chance to read, is that Kisulu, a Norwegian filmmaker comes to make a film about, so Kisulu is doing planting trees and doing the kind of, you can see as a kind of a new generation of Wangari Maathai, the kind of work that Wangari Maathai did in Kenya, planting trees and things like that. And the woman comes to film a documentary about his work in this community. And he said, I will agree on one condition, that you give me my camera as well. That, you know, I will agree that you film me if you give me my camera. So the film really is playing with this, what she's filming and what Kisulu is doing. So, and I think that is significant. Kisulu, to come to your question, Kisulu recognizes that this, you know, it didn't reject filming. It said, but he knows that you know, this can be an object of his objectification or one that amplifies his story and his work and his community. And he said, give me a camera too. So, and it is a process of trying to use that camera that is saying, why can't we be seen? So in this, so is, you know, is kind of reappropriating the technology. It's trying to let technology do its work for him. So I think so, yeah, that the story, you know, if we think about Kisulu and other examples here, it is the use to, so that's, so we can't say, well, it becomes it's not something we can say, let's eradicate. You know, no, but if we're mindful of these problems, it's like the problems, you know, of AI in this recognized AI article. And yeah, thanks for that. I was, you know, that you sent me that I was looking at before this talk today, that it is when we know these deep histories, when we know these problems, then it allows us to think of how can we take these tools now for the work for their redemptive possibilities and not replicate that their exploitative problems. So I think, yeah, so it's the use that is the problem. Yeah, and you know, they are used well. You know, farmers who are using technology to be able to figure out when, you know, when drought is coming and what to do with water and things like that. You have those amazing stories across Africa. Technology is allowing them, you know, even, you know, mobile bank, financial inclusion, you know, mobile banking. You know, I just had a talk, you know, on Ghana, actually, you know, someone, you know, the way, you know, what technology, so women who are unbanked, who are unbanked, you know, small market women who don't have the time to go to the bank. So now they go to them, and through mobile banking, they are doing their, you know, their bank, they have access to loans to grow their businesses. That's technology, that's work of technology too. So we have to tell a full story. So it's, yeah, so it's the use to which we put in it.
These are laser sharp answers, and I really appreciate that. That's a special gift. Do we have any questions from the audience? Are there more than one question? Is there more than one question? We're almost out of time. Because we can take all the questions at once and then, okay. Go ahead, and do you want to speak it? I can just repeat.
Okay, yeah, yeah, I don't just say.
Brighter futures and imagine. Yeah. Wow, that's freaky. But we talk a lot about envisioning brighter futures and imagining brighter futures, right? And we talk a lot about visibility and how important that is. While I agree they're all important, the devil's advocate in me and also the angel's advocate in me tells me that that's not enough.
Mm,
Imagining is not doing.
mm,
As much as visibility can help,
mm.
people are still being killed on a daily basis
Mhm,
in droves.
mhm,
And as much as we know about, for instance, the genocide in Gaza,
mhm,
um, it's still happening.
mm,
Um, I think a lot of people, and part of myself, see violence as the only real solution, the only action they can take to actually affect change,
mm,
especially when certain global actors such as the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank are not only enabling but contributing to certain economic practices that
mm,
severely exacerbate these issues.
right.
So I guess my question is ultimately, what can we do? And secondly, would that even be possible under the current economic or political systems that we live under today?
Wow, that's a big
Easy
question.
question.
Yeah, we should give you a PhD for that already, you know. And yeah. Thanks for the question, Spencer. I think this is what I would say, that that I agree with you. The fundamental premise of your work, that imagining is not, well, it's just like my answer to the question about slow violence, that it is not just one thing, it is one of many things that we do. Now let's take civil rights history for as a quick example. In my introduction of my African Ecomedia, I wrote about Emmett Till, and after his death and things like that. And at that moment, the idea was, let's just bury him. And his mother said, no, the world needs to see what happened to my son. And, yeah, that's one instance of strategic exposure. A mother shouldn't want to see, that should be the last memory of a child that a mother should want to see, right? But at that moment, she was thinking beyond herself, her grief and her mourning her family. She thought that this was an opportunity to turn around the civil rights movement. And that's exactly what happened. That it was from seeing that, other actions, it became, it became this this media event that's catalyzed actions, the kind of actions they were thinking about, and that led to the Civil Rights Acts and different kind of things. And I think, yeah, Professor Ugo mentioned South Africa earlier. We think about the death of Hector Peterson in Soweto, in that massacre. And when when those images were smuggled out of South Africa and published around the world, that was the beginning of the end of apartheid. I think we can't disconnect the work of exposure from the work of doing, because people need to be prodded to do. You know, there were things that will have prodded you to do, to action. So that we can see all of them as really this, to use the language organizing our gathering today, we can see all this as technologies of mobilization toward the end that we want. So whether it's in stopping civil rights, whether it's in ending apartheid, or whether it's in ending the suffering in the Middle East today, that they are all interconnected. So when South Africa, for example, files a brief at the ICC or to about Israel, they didn't show up empty-handed. They didn't just say, well, Israel has done this. They were bringing in images, and so there was a kind of storytelling, a kind of narrative, that images was part of that arsenal that South Africa was mobilizing in that case. So that I want us to to think of, these are um complex problems that require more than one way to address. Yeah. I don't know what the ultimate solution is. I think that's part of the problem of our gathering here. But yeah, we can't disconnect. We have to bring different things together, to bring about what we want.
That seems like an appropriate conclusion for our event tonight. We're at time. And I want to thank our of course, our panelists for their contributions and our esteemed guests as well. So please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Good.
And thanks to the Zoom audience for your
Yes,
patience with
yes,
everything.
thank-
For this non-Zoom audience, there are cookies and drinks here. Please take them with you. Have a good night.